Welcome to the Bridgehead with Jonathon Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'll be your host for the next half hour. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to the news recently will have noticed it would be a funny trend if it wasn't so deadly serious, and that is the complete erosion of free speech on university campuses across North America. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms recently released a report that gave dozens of Fs to various Canadian universities for how they treated free speech, because universities are less and less a place where ideas can be openly debated, and more a place in which we see left-wing ideology being incubated to the point that we can see what hatches. And that's something I found quite interesting, and I wrote a column on this recently, that if you want to see where the left actually wants to take us, all you have to do is look at universities, because these are places where they hold almost complete control. These universities, by and large, have very liberal faculty members. They teach very liberal courses. History is taught from a very liberal perspective. The whole reason people talk about conservative university professors is because they are so rare. They rarely speak openly. And I went to university for history for 4 years, and I was also a campus activist. I ran a pro-life club on Simon Fraser University. And suppression of free speech was extremely common. And we had the good fortune at Simon Fraser University for a few years at least of a very libertarian student union. So we managed to stage all of our events without much of a backlash, with the exception of our Cemetery of the Innocents being trashed by one would-be student politician. But there are many universities across Canada in which that's not the case. And we've seen almost every Canadian university getting taken to court at some point or another over the last 5 to 10 years for restricting the free speech rights of students. Now, it's ridiculous that these cases even go to court, because in many cases, the universities are arguing that they have the right to restrict free speech because they're claiming that, for example, they're only partially funded by the government. But that aside, the idea that a university would have the desire to suppress free speech, I think speaks loudly to the ideological state of universities at large. Now, it's interesting that a new documentary has come out featuring Pastor Douglas Wilson of Moscow, Idaho, called The Free Speech Apocalypse. Comes out when it does, because we're seeing these protests sweep right now across the United States, where universities are melting down into a complete madhouse. Now, recently, Douglas Wilson was there, attending Indiana University, which is the home of the Kinsey Institute. Alfred Kinsey, as anyone who listens to this show will know, was a renowned pervert who released the Kinsey Reports in 1948 and 1953, claiming that enormous numbers of Americans were essentially engaging in all kinds of illegal sexual behavior, that 10% of the population engaged in homosexual behavior, and that even staggering numbers of the public engaged in sex with animals or prostitutes, and virtually nobody was actually faithful to his or her spouse. So these reports, which had been long since debunked by scholars such as Dr. Judith Reisman in her book Sex, Lies, and Kinsey, formed the cornerstone of the sexual revolution. So it was rather interesting when Douglas Wilson went to give voluntary lectures at Indiana University called Sexual by Design. It's important to note here that people are not forced to attend these lectures. They don't have to go there. So the people who show up at these lectures are showing up on purpose. Now, give a little bit of a listen here to the reaction Douglas Wilson got when he started speaking to a lecture hall.
Okay, thank you. Picking up where we were. That amounts to a heckler's veto. It's not protected speech.
God creates this, at this stage he says it's good.
That's a lot of love! Here, go down next time. Grow up!
At the next stage he says it's good, the next stage he says it's good, and then he gets to a solitary male, one guy, and God says it's not good. He says it's not good that man should be alone. So good, good, good. Solitary male, not so good. This boy needs some improvement. So, what does he do?
Thanks for coming.
They're attacking queers out here! They're attacking
No.
queers! Attacking people protesting, come out!
Doesn't sound very believable.
Douglas Wilson! Douglas Wilson! You're not welcome here! You're not welcome here! On our campus! Anyone who agrees! Anyone who agrees! Join us now! Join us now! You believe! You believe! Slavery is ideal! Slavery is ideal! Women are inferior! Women are inferior! Gays deserve! They deserve! Death or exile! Death or exile! We reject racism! We reject racism! Misogyny! We reject misogyny! We reject homophobia! We reject homophobia! We did it! We did it! We will not be silent! We will not be silent! Indiana University! Indiana University! Should be! Should be! A safe space for everyone! A safe space for everyone! We respect free speech! We respect free speech! But this is hate speech! But this is hate speech! Get off our campus! Get off our campus! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Douglas Wilson, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Douglas Wilson, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Douglas Wilson, go away!
All right, folks. My name is Steve Hulke. I'm the Assistant Dean of Students, and for all your IU students, at the freshman induction ceremony, you pledged an oath to Indiana University's Indiana Promise, talking about the civility and dignity of all persons. So I ask of you, since you're on an Indiana University campus and are part of this community, to treat everyone with business dignity and respect. So if you don't like what's being said, leave. If you want to protest, please do so in a peaceful manner, so we can have a marketplace of ideas. Marketplace of ideas.
It's interesting, isn't it, how diversity and tolerance evaporate in the face of left-wing ideology. And like I said, I've seen this more times than I can count. Pro-life displays, if they can't get them barred from campus in the first place, are generally barricaded by very loud crowds of mooing and booing people. If we set up a display, they often try to cover it up with bed sheets, actually, which I always found to be a sadly and cruelly ironic thing to do. In addition to that, lectures, debates are often shouted down because their views are not up for debate. So this is what we've seen in Canada, but what we've seen in the States over the last 2 months now is even more ridiculous. We've got university administrators being forced to resign for completely invented and fictitious accusations. And what's so crazy about this is that university professors and university administrations are almost universally liberal. So it's sort of like watching the snake choke on its own tail here. These people have promoted left-wing ideology for decades and have now created these little monsters who are turning around and claiming they're not left-wing enough. When you're not overtly racist, when you're not saying anything overtly offensive, you may still be the perpetrator of what are now known as microaggressions, which, as Douglas Wilson pointed out, should be treated with a healthy dose of micro-caring. You've got journalists being kicked out of student quote-unquote safe spaces. Safe spaces on campus, and these are not safe spaces, to protect people from actual physical violence or any actual real threat. These safe spaces are being set up to protect students' feelings from words. There was a professor recently who faced a massive protest in his classroom for marking grammar, because apparently his grammar indicated some sort of entrenched belief in the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy of blah, blah, blah. But students were breaking out into tears over this and were protesting his classroom. And now you've got these swarms of weirdly left-wing students that are shouting down their liberal and university administrators. I think the recent protest was actually sparked off by an email in which a university administrator suggested that on Halloween, costumes of all sorts could be used. Now, one of the new left-wing obsessions is this whole idea of cultural appropriation, which means that you apparently can't do something that belongs to another culture, which is weird because I thought the point of multiculturalism is we could enjoy the cultures of other people. And recently the University of Ottawa, they were talking about banning yoga because that appropriated it from some Eastern peoples, and now in the States, I guess you can't dress in a sombrero because that's appropriating stuff from Mexicans, or might even be considered simply to be racist. This is all very confusing. I'm with George Will, who wrote in the National Review that he thought that Halloween sort of ended more or less around adolescence. But the point is that now everyone is guilty. So even if you're not a racist, you're still a racist. You just don't know it yet. You need to have some university students explain to you how you are in fact a racist by accidentally culturally appropriating something, by accidentally correcting someone's grammar, by accidentally maybe using words or terminology or hand gestures that somehow indicate you're part of some sort of, Knights of the Templar Anglo-Saxon hierarchy. It's just so ridiculous, it's not even funny. And these people don't believe in freedom of speech. They're talking about safe spaces where they have to be safe from the words and ideas of those who disagree with them. Huge numbers of American millennials actually advocate for making speech that offends certain minorities illegal. This is terrifying stuff. And I always say, if you want to know what the game of the left is, the end game, look at university, the place where they hold almost complete power. And even in spite of that, the student mob has turned on the very administrators who, by and large, share their values. And it's Jonah Goldberg, and it was in the National Review, I believe, was sort of cackling about this, how it couldn't have happened to a nicer group of people, liberal professors and administrators, basically now bearing the brunt of this entitled, victim-obsessed generation. And there's a meme going around Facebook that I thought was very indicative, comparing a generation of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who fought in World War II, and came up the beaches at Utah and Omaha and Juneau, to this generation where they're in tears because professors are marking their grammar for using random words. This is beyond pathetic. And for myself, the only reason I've engaged in the free speech battle, more or less, is because I wrote for a campus newspaper. I do a lot of writing now. But additionally to that, of course, I work in the pro-life movement. So freedom of speech is essential for me because my organization, my colleagues, we use this in order to spread the truth about abortion. And the first casualty of political correctness is always truth. Christians obviously have a very unpopular point of view, and this is a point of view that we need freedom of speech to be able to promulgate. So this documentary, The Free Speech Apocalypse, was a very fascinating one because it showed Douglas being shouted down on a university campus, and then showed lots of interviews with Douglas Wilson discussing the state of free speech, and actually pointing out that our freedoms are slowly but surely being eroded by a system that's actually willing to, fine bakers and fine photographers for not essentially helping out in gay weddings. And get this, there was one couple, a Christian baker, that they wouldn't make, or they declined a request to bake a wedding cake for a lesbian wedding, and they were fined over $100,000 for the crime of mental rape, which is something that's literally just been invented. It's not an actual thing. It's not a diagnosable condition. Essentially, he hurt their feelings and then had to pay over $100,000 for that. So this is just one of the stories featured in the Free Speech Apocalypse documentary. So I called up Reverend Douglas Wilson, and we had a bit of a chat, and I hope you enjoy our discussion.
I'll start right off by pointing out that your documentary seems to be playing out in real time over the past week or two here on campuses all the way across the United States, where you've got these swarms of entitled and petulant students that are trying to get people fired for entirely mysterious reasons and insisting on safe spaces. What's been your take on all of this?
It's almost like a higher powers at work or something, because we released the movie and then a bunch of instances of the same basic phenomenon start playing out over time. It really is remarkable, and it's hard to see it as anything other than just a naked power grab. People don't want to argue. They don't want to debate positions. They just want to take it. I call it totalitarians.
How effective, do you think it can be? Now, I've done activism on campuses before. I've hosted debates and things like that, and almost universally you get large crowds of protesters who are upset that it's taking place. But this seems to be taking it even a step further. You've got university administrators actually resigning. You have police forces that are virtually helpless. It's interesting just because these students are woefully undereducated. Most of the liberal arts degrees that they're actually taking seem to be in rather farcical topics, but at the same time, they seem to be gaining traction.
Yes, and basically what we have on display with the administrations of many of these colleges is a failure of nerve. In other words, what we're dealing with is not an argument, but rather a demand and a temper tantrum. And people have learned, it's like seeing a kid flip out in a restaurant or in Walmart because he wants to get his parents to give him something. And eventually the parents will cave to the extortion demand and give their kid what he wants, what he's demanding. And it would take courage and strength and stamina to do anything else.
Well, this brings us sort of directly to the documentary that just came out featuring the reaction you got at the University of Indiana, the Free Speech Apocalypse, because I've said for a long time that if you want to find out what the end game of the secular left is, look at universities, because that's the one place where they hold almost complete power. And you can see very quickly that universities serve as a microcosm for the ideal left-wing society. And in the documentary, you and the filmmaker examine a lot of different instances of this totalitarianism, as you put it, extending and slowly creeping into other areas of society. So what happens when the virus escapes its environment?
When this virus gets out of the universities, we will be living in a police state. That's what it boils down to. You will not be allowed to say, think, or do certain things that your grandparents could easily say, think, or do.
What are some examples of this? Because you cover quite a few in the documentary.
Yeah. One would be pastors preaching on sexual sin. Another would be wedding photographers or bakers declining to help celebrate a same-sex marriage ceremony. Another example would be freedom of pastors to preach and teach. Evangelism, that would be another one, where you are reaching out to people, telling them to repent of their sins and believe in Jesus. Well, repent of what sins?
Right.
Well, if you if you get into certain things that are protected, they'll hammer you. Indications of that sort of pattern happening over and over again in history. You cannot govern a people that you have contempt for once they understand that you do.
Right. So what are the encouraging signs you've seen of this then?
I've seen encouraging signs of Christians articulating the case against the overweening state. I've seen a lot of Christians who are willing to follow the argument and what the Scripture teaches all the way out to the end. If Jesus is Lord, then Caesar isn't.
What final message would you give to all of those to encourage them to watch the documentary, and what you hope they should take out of it?
Yeah, the encouragement, there's a story I've told about a Marine general in the Korean War who, after the Chinese poured into the war, and his unit was completely surrounded. And the Marine general looked around and saw them all there and said, well, they can't get away now. So the thing I would encourage Christians to do is see the film, be sobered, appropriately sobered. But the thing that I'm so grateful about is that everything is now clear.
Right.
There's no ambiguity about where we all stand anymore.
We can dispense with the formalities.
Yeah, right. As I said one time in a blog post, as some sailor might have said at Pearl Harbor, after the second wave of Japanese planes had flown over, he could say the time for nuance is past.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Reverend Douglas Wilson joining me to talk about his new documentary, The Free Speech Apocalypse, and to talk about the free speech apocalypse more generally, because obviously, as I've been going over with you, there are examples of freedom of speech being taken down all over the place, and I'd like to just add one more thing to that. What we're noticing actually is the rights of Christians, the rights of people in general, being replaced with sexual rights. In essence, sexual rights supersede all other rights, no matter what. And that's why, if you refuse to participate, for example, in a same-sex wedding, then you are going to be forced to, because your religious liberty, your right to refuse to provide that service, is now trumped by the right of a gay couple to demand your services at a ceremony celebrating their relationship. That's just the way it is now. It's like the right to life has been more or less abolished because abortionists need to kill babies in order to serve as the cleanup crews for people who want to have irresponsible sex. That's basically more or less what this boils down to. Your right to not have to be subjected to, for example, public nudity is abrogated in favor of the right to gay pride parades, for example. And there's also just nudist parades and slut walks and you name it now. And this is not even about sexuality. I have friends who are gay who are disgusted by the gay pride parade because it's basically exhibitionist nudity, drag queens, you name it. And I think the idea that a bunch of older men should be allowed to wave their genitals at crowds full of children is repulsive. And I think any reasonable person would agree with that. But none of these things can be discussed anymore because at the end of the day, your right to have sex with who you want, when you want, however you want, now supersedes the right of virtually every other group. Sexual minorities are now considered to be an actual victim class of people. Who you choose to have sex with now defines what your identity is. Your identity tells you which group you're part of, and at the end of the day, those who believe in the Judeo-Christian ethics are being relegated to the backwater of society, and first and foremost, their freedom of speech is being silenced. And that's what is covered so brilliantly in the documentary, the coming Free Speech Apocalypse. I would encourage all of you to go to freespeechapocalypse.com and check out the previews and maybe even watch it for yourself. And keep an eye on the news. And before you decide to spend a fortune going to university, research at university first and find out if you're going to go to one of these universities with some petulant mob of man-children screaming for the rights basically the right not to hear any idea that they dislike on a university campus, because it's a truly pathetic thing to behold. Well, thanks a lot for joining us this week, and we hope you'll come around again next week too.